Welcome to World City. I'm Allison Arieff. I'm the Director of Communications at Replica, and I am joined here today by Laura Crescimano, Principal and Co-founder of SiteLab Urban Studio, and we're going to have a chat about planning for uncertainty. To begin with, Laura, it's great to see you. Can you start by introducing yourself, and if you could just tell us a bit more about SiteLab Urban Studio?
Sure. I'm Laura Crescimano, as Allison said, co-founder of SiteLab Urban Studio. We are an urban design and strategy practice based in the Bay Area in San Francisco, started in 2012. And we are a mix of designers, architects, landscape architects, city planners, and we wear many hats. So we're storytellers and advocates, facilitators, translators, all kinds of things. And really that our approach is to recasting our design practice as a social practice. So we started with a commitment to helping to shape our cities, how our cities grow in sustainable and equitable ways that are really focused on people and bringing in people's voices.
Can you talk about a couple of the projects that you've been working on recently?
So our work really ranges. Just to give a couple of examples, perhaps, we just reached a milestone working with the city of San Jose and Google to have approved 80-acre framework plan that allows for an expansion of the downtown at a major transit hub. So that include a mix from, workplace for Google, as well as housing for, market rate for anyone, housing, affordable housing, parks, cultural, historic rehab, all the ingredients to hopefully making a great addition to downtown San Jose. So from something like that, which was a robust team from, people at Google in the city and around the world, to working with the Port of San Francisco on their long-range plan for resiliency and the seawall in, looking at climate change, seismic issues, flooding, sea level rise, and how can we think more transformatively of the opportunity to be prepared for the future along San Francisco's coastline.
Yeah, we called this discussion Planning for Uncertainty, which I think all planning is planning for uncertainty because nothing is a given, as we well know, in urban planning. But how has planning changed in terms of that level of uncertainty over the past few years? We've had a pandemic. We're increasingly aware of climate change. Community engagement is a whole different ballgame. This is a huge question, but if you could speak a little bit to the changes that you've seen over the last several years.
Well, first, I totally agree with you that uncertainty is actually the certainty. People say that like the only constant is change. I think that that's really true. I think that's also some aspects of that are a good thing, right? I think that maybe this time has shown us, or maybe revealed, that level of uncertainty that was always there, and more there for certain people than others. I think that perhaps has opened us up to thinking differently, that we have a capacity for change. We saw what happened, to like the air quality when, all the cars were off the road. We are questioning what it means to have a commercial only downtown and what the workflow of workplace is. So I think that one, uncertainty can be a tool, or understanding our resilience and our adaptability and our capacity for change. I think that's maybe a piece that has changed in this last year. I would also say that I think there is a renewed attention to our human experience in many different ways from this, and the need to actually really attend to that and protect for that, and to listen to each other. And that's a huge part of the way we work. And I have to say, my experience, you know, my training, I'm trained as an architect, and my training did not involve talking to people outside of the school. And that's something that I found really frustrating. And I think that part of this is learning how to bring more people into a conversation, particularly around city shaping and urban design that's going to affect people, people's lives, and that should really be a product of much more than one designer or one group of people, and can be so much better for that. And so that's a big part of our work that I think has gotten more opportunity or more validity, perhaps, in this time. And this time is hard. So just, I mean, we're all struggling in different ways. And I think that it's also perhaps in that expressing our humanity and making it hard to, you know, have your work self and your home self be separate. I think that we have to think more about how we're building capacity in each other, and to have conversations that build capacity for change, because it's not easy. And one of the things we look to do is to try to help make more accessible how to have those conversations, or to communicate clearly in the way that we draw and the way that we express ideas, so that it's more digestible and we can really engage in a deeper conversation with more people about the places we live in.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. It just seems there's been such a shift from, say, the age of Daniel Burnham planning. It's like one guy's vision for everything, which I think is really still taught quite a lot in school too. And you know, all this stuff is evolving, but it doesn't always catch up, or that the practice is going back far enough. I think that as you know, because you and I have talked about it, I mean, my daughter started being exposed to these ideas as early as like first grade, when her school did this kind of mini urban planning project. I think it's fascinating that I certainly was never taught about how a city or a place is made at any point in time growing up. And that you see how integral that is, and what kind of a dearth of knowledge and understanding there is in the world at large. Can you maybe talk about some of the engagement efforts that you've engaged in that have been particularly successful or memorable, or maybe not successful? I mean, you've been doing this work for such a long time. I mean, we live in the Bay Area. Arguably, there's no more challenging place to do the kind of work that you're doing, because we suffer, as some say, often from too much democracy. But it does feel like you've had a particular skill in reaching people in communities with your work, and I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to that.
Sure. Well, I think just going back to where you started, that the master architect was certainly a part of my education. And, you know, we have shifted from calling the work that we do master planning or master plans to framework plans, really, because they are more about setting up a platform and a framework for things to unfold and many people to create their pieces. And that's a better outcome. And I think it was never true. The master architect was never even true.
Right.
And, you know, it takes a lot to shift that dynamic. And we work pretty hard at it. And we do represent a different model. We're a very diverse group. We're a woman-led practice, which is not as common as it should be.
Yeah.
So that, and I think that even in ourselves, we represent a shift. And so I think that my entire team, in how they show up, also signals to people a different conversation. And part of that is showing up to listen, you know, showing up with humility, which is like, you know, that's just step one, you know, to any of this. And I think it also is tied to that idea of uncertainty, which is accepting that reality of uncertainty, and that we don't control and shouldn't control all of the outcomes. And can we invite more people in and believe in the value of what they're going to add? And so I do think part of our success has been in that actual genuine curiosity and interest in hearing people. And then it's all kinds of strategies of, different modes of communication, testing and learning, being willing to change. I don't think, people talk about community outreach, and we try to shift that to community engagement, which, is a common phrase as well, but that there is a difference between outreach and engagement. And maybe sometimes you're just doing outreach, but outreach is telling people about something versus having a conversation and being willing to reflect back those changes. And I would say it's not always easy, and I don't always agree with what I'm hearing in those conversations. And there's like lots of conflicts. So part of it is putting everyone in dialogue to hear and trying to talk honestly about trade-offs of different choices. And I do believe you've heard that kind of like the democracy, like, we've in the Bay Area and San Francisco, it's like kind of loops itself all the way around to paralysis in many cases. At the same time, that the success of democracy, I believe, is that dance. And that if we didn't have it, we would be in trouble. So I do, as much as it frustrates me sometimes when I don't agree with what is, if someone's opposing work that we're doing, and which is something that happens on a regular basis. Right. But that's, if they weren't there, in the end, I don't think the projects would be as good. Right. And so, and having people engage and see either their input taken seriously and reflected back and or changing the outcomes, then creates a situation where more people have ownership and interest and investment in the success of the place. And these places don't succeed if everyone is just kind of like, if it's, history is lost and, layers of who has been there is lost. I think that's where we get into places that feel generic. So we do look for how to kind of tap into that authenticity. And I would say that's another core piece of our work, which is we start any project or process with trying to understand a place and understand it, whether that's the environmental and ecological history of a place and what makes it distinct versus any other place, or the kind of cultural, social, those layers of history and patterns and people and stories to try to, be embedded in the places as they already exist. And no project, no place is new. Or tabula rasa, right? I don't believe in that concept.
You're not a big fan of the cities from scratch movement?
Not really.
You're doing a lot. It's fascinating, but yeah, you're doing a lot of work in Silicon Valley. So how do you balance this kind of urge for quantitative versus the desire for qualitative placemaking?
It's a great question. And it's something it's an ongoing debate I have and discussion, because often I do react that the quantitative can feel reductive. And it's useful. It's very useful to be able to have metrics and to make it digestible and be able to look at it that way. And I think that in the same way, any engagement we do where we ask people about what they want, we always ask why. Why is so important? Because it may not be about the literal thing, or there may be other ways to solve for that need or desire. So I think in the metrics, I think there's, again, we benefit a lot from Silicon Valley and the advances and the technology, and we shouldn't see that again as wholly, that we've created a whole new field of analysis, right? There is like a legacy of so much research and study and theorizing and understanding of how people use places and how we, I think, marry that. And what I would say is also, an example I would say is Streetwise is organization that has looked to help to gather data about places that qualifies it more. So, and asks people to help qualify it.
Mhm.
So the difference between saying there's some mapping that says there's a grocery store in every corner and
Mhm.
someone in that neighborhood saying, actually, that's a liquor store that has
Mhm.
stale bread on the shelf, right?
Yeah.
Like those are two different things. And so there is that, like, I think there's a two-step, right? That, you know, there's the data is valuable and we need to qualify it and interrogate it.
Yeah, for sure.
So
I mean, I always say, like, no one visits Rome because it's efficient. You have to you have to balance
yes,
what draws someone to a city. And there is such a tendency, I think, to be reductive. I think people who say, for example, so I was on a call with someone the other day who said cities exist as places of work. Like that was kind of the only reason for being for a city, just kind of distilling it to essence. Like you would only ever be there because of that reason. And it seems like any of those kind of singular things misses the point.
exactly.
Yeah, I did an interview last week with Fritjof Capra, the physicist who wrote the Tao of Physics, and his whole thing is, you have scientific rationality on one side, and you have this Eastern spirituality on the other side, and you can't sort of divorce those two. You need to kind of understand that everything is connected, which in a way feels like very California loosey-goosey, but also I think is really integral to the kind of work that you're doing of sort of like, hopefully in San Jose, they're not thinking about high-speed rail and transit without also thinking about what else is going on there. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that systemic approach to planning.
Yes. So I would say what we are actually doing is trying to create, experiences and places for living and working and being together. And so that isn't just about things, it isn't a practice of just building buildings, say. They're built, how do they perform? How do we experience them? And so for us, I would say, taking the example of downtown West in San Jose, that it is about putting workplaces and housing near transit and connecting those to the downtown. But it's also about what's that experience when you come from the station and actually come upon a confluence of a creek and a river on your way to downtown, on your way to like the existing downtown. So I think what is the experience from point A to point B, and how can you create choices and more layers and opportunities, and connect to I would say similar to what you were saying about just not making it singular, right? So I think connecting to that we can have an urban transit-rich place and actually a fairly ecologically rich place. And that actually is pretty vital to our well-being. And there's a lot of science behind that, and public health data behind that, and mental health. So looking for those, like unearthing those layers and finding ways to stitch those together, because it isn't about making one thing or one liner the absolute, right? And so that, continuing to, building your transit is a good principle. Cities, and I would say the cities as a workplace, origin of cities is actually shared resources, right? Coming together to share in resources. And I think resources is a great, like, broad term that that
not just financial ones. Yeah.
Yes.
I think to your point about public space, I always hesitate to say bright side of COVID, because in the end, there aren't any. In terms of the bright spots that we usually think of them. I do think, though, it increased the awareness of the importance of green in public space. And I'm wondering if you are seeing that, are people still like commit to that, and are you seeing it manifest in the projects that you're doing?
Yes, I mean, I think it's a huge learning, let's say, from this time. And, one of the things that we've been interested in for years now is how important our streets are. And our streets are public spaces. And that we need to think about them as that glue of our public realm. And so I do think that we've all come to rely on outdoor spaces. And there is so much more we could do with our streets and our public realm, and look at how it could support people's public lives and health, actually. And, I think there's different parts of this. I would say there's one side of this which has to do more with nature and ecology. And there we know, as I mentioned, that more access to nature, green, honestly, even paintings of landscape create better health outcomes and improve mental health, right? So we know that that can make our lives actually better. And I think there is perhaps more attention to that importance. And I hope, and I know a lot of people are doing great work around this, that we can also look at that in terms of what as an environmental justice issue, right? Like where are there street trees in our cities and places? Where are there access to public spaces that have, more greening and nature? And that's something, we call it ecological urbanism as a part of our practice, because we started out being fairly focused on the social aspects of public space and how design can foster that coming together. And became increasingly aware that the way to feel connected to place is very much tied also to the ecology of a place. That's actually, those are literally the roots. And we worked with groups like San Francisco Estuary Institute, who are, a group of scientists doing amazing work in trying to translate that science into outcomes and guidelines. And so we really think that there is this way to have both, that we don't have to have cities and then nature, that there can be ways to weave things together. So I think that there is growing body of work on that, and growing understanding that we've seen those experiences. We've seen streets close down, even just only on the weekends, say, or in the evening, and how that feels. We've seen what it looks like, and the clearer skies and better air quality with less commuting. I think there is a great opportunity there, and to think about how we can just be smarter, multi-purpose spaces more. Not all of it has to be formally designed. Some of it can be, I'm very excited that this weekend in San Francisco has, this, but a practice of Sunday streets, where one street gets closed down at one Sunday a month, and this weekend is citywide Sunday streets, and an encouragement of block parties, and this just like turn your street into a place of community. And I think that I hope that we are learning that we can test things more. Process is, huge about process and participation, and not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. That we the other choice of not using these spaces or not creating more equitable access to nature is not the better outcome. So I'm optimistic about that. I also think that we've learned the joy of our neighborhoods more, those of us who have the privilege to, and those ingredients, that real mix of public spaces and local retail and places to live, and finding ways to work, and walkability. And so I do hope that becomes potentially a trend that can inform the kind of history of planning that has kept things more separate. This is where you live, this is where you work, to mix it together more.
I think it really offers both a challenge and an opportunity for the whole realm of architecture and planning, right? I wrote a a piece several years ago about Alameda Farmers Market here in San Francisco, which is one of my favorite public spaces in the city, and it is relentlessly undesigned. I mean, it actually couldn't be designed more terribly than it is. But in a way, that's what's so great about it, is that there's no, it's one day a week, it just manifests itself as this like thriving, active space that works. And I think if a team was brought in to quote unquote improve it, they'd probably ruin it. And so there's this, it seems to me so much about the work you're doing is kind of knowing how much to do. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that too. I mean, if you are, I love this term, framework instead of master plan. How do you kind of navigate that that balance between designing and directing, but also like kind of letting stuff be what it is?
Right. Well, one take on the farmers market would say it's actually co-designed, right? That like all of the people that come together to make that happen are doing that and in an active and ongoing way.
Right.
And it's not perhaps top-down design, but a platform has been created, right? And in this case, it's largely a platform as a service parking lot, which became useful for, you know, a COVID testing
COVID
setup
testing also, yeah.
on other days, right? So that, I mean, I think there's a lot that's fascinating and something to say for like underutilized spaces in certain ways that can have, like you said, that sometimes it's not about efficiency and optimization. So I do think that we need some slack in the system, right? Places where it can be like, oh, there's, and you know, I would say one example is we've been working for a long time with a neighborhood here to work on more kind of public realm greening and different opportunities. And we took like space next, there was this greenway next to the highway that they've now, I mean, the community's completely taken it on their own, given it life of like gardening and a little amphitheater and all these things that are adjacent to the main street and a coffee shop. So those are the kinds of spaces that were, it was no man's land because it was next to, it's like controlled by the highway, and you know, and there are different opportunities there. But I would say going back to this kind of the design, right? How much design control. One of the things we're very interested in is the process, not, you know, versus the product. And so like you can design the process, and in this case, maybe it's not very much of a process, or it's a permit process, or it's just the, like, there are some rules of engagement that allow for people then to have that freedom inside of it. And I absolutely agree that I think creating places where is not singular authorship, right? So that if it is one design and there is no room to kind of appropriate or own pieces, even moment, you know, even temporary, those are, you know, we're going to connect to that less. There's going to be less opportunity for more different people to connect and express themselves, which means those places have less, will like mean less, right? Like we will attach fewer stories to them in many ways. And so there are, you know, not to say there are places, you know, you think about like institutional or civic moments that there are about a larger representation and expression, but I'm really interested, especially in our cities, about how we can let go of that control in key places, and how can we actually design in that openness. And it is not, the industry does not drive in that direction, right? Efficiency of construction, management of risk. There's a lot of things that make us not want to do that. And I think it's really important to push against that and demonstrate, as we've seen in so many cases, how that can be like the value outweighs the risk.
Yeah, and I think these last 2 years have shown so much kind of the importance of testing and iteration, and indeed, like a lot of tech things. Like in the beginning of the pandemic, it was like plexiglass, like it was all about plexiglass. everybody needs plexiglass. And then it was like, oh, wait, maybe we don't need that. Maybe we could do this other thing. I mean, I have another architect friend who's basically been redesigning restaurants to better facilitate takeout and delivery, right? So there's all these shifts that have been happening pretty quickly and iteratively, which I think has been quite useful. We're winding down on time, so I wanted to shift a little bit, though. Of course, these things are all connected. What would you share with other people doing this kind of work who are looking to pay more attention to climate change? I mean, I think part of that is like, just as we shouldn't tack on equity as like, oh, equity is a nice to have or sustainability is a nice to have, but it's more sort of integrated. Can you talk about how you are making sure that is an integral part of the work that you're doing?
Sure, it is. It's a big one. And I think it's, there are so many different parts of talking about this. And, the difference between there's sustainability, there's resilience. Those are not necessarily the same thing. And in our work also we're looking at, there is trying to slow down climate change, and then there is also adapting to realities of change. And so there are a lot of different layers to work on, and I think that all of them important. And we look at, well, one piece I would say is it can be so daunting. It can be so daunting, and the more we worked on the Resilient by Design effort a few years ago that was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and a day long of lectures of experts, which were like, the sea is rising. You can't go to the up around because of the earthquake fault lines. It was just like at a certain point at the end of the day, it was like unparalleled, right? So I would say, I think we have to be eyes open. We have to hear all of that, but we also have to look for what we can rally around, and how in the face of something very challenging, is there transformative opportunity? And so that's what I would say about like the thinking around San Francisco coastline is like, what if we are willing to be bold, or we were willing to think in long time scales, what would that open up for us? And how could we not think about it only as an engineering problem or a scientific problem? And while it's very important to get projections right, you're never going to. Speaking of uncertainty, we could spend the rest of our lives debating those projections. And so I think it's both about willing to be bold and think about it as not only a mitigation, but also an opportunity. And so, because we need, human nature behavior, we need something positive to move toward. And so I think that where you can say, like, how do we maybe shift the balance of something that has, like, create more space for people, create more, space for nature, create a testing ground for other, activities, or, those are the things I think that it's really important to hold. And that's be a macro thing. That's not just about climate change, right? And then it's like, a long ago, I feel like when LEAD first started, maybe was a class about it, and the person said something about also thinking about self-sustainability. And so you don't always have to convince the client or convince, just like, what can you do just as your basic practice? And I think the same thing has to do with like the idea of listening in, as a practice is not like, this is our equity program. It's that is just like the way we want to relate to each other. And so I think sustainability and resilience is a similar conversation about what are the little things we can just start to do, and where can we push? But so much is beyond the designers, I would say, and our control. And there is a lot, and the importance of, political advocacy, investment in shifting infrastructure, and making that, seeing the benefits of how we can, the day-to-day experiences actually could be benefited.
I know it could be. I have this slide that I often show of sort of the first solar panels on a house in the 1930s. It's just like, it's not that we don't know how to do this. We're just not doing it. But I think that holding on to some degree of optimism is, of course, important. We can't scare everyone into action. That I don't think it's working so well. Some balance there. We're out of time. This has been so amazing to talk to you all day. So thank you, and thank you to World City for having us. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.